It is 6 o'clock Central European time, so we're ready to start the webinar. Hello everyone, thanks for joining our webinar on Qt tech support with tricks and tips. During the session, if you have any questions, please submit them via the question box at the bottom of the interface. Those questions will be answered at the end. We have our experts, Andy, Kati and Kimmo, ready to answer your questions during our live Q&A. This webinar will also be recorded and you will receive a copy of it along with the slides delivered to your email account. Hope you enjoy, and I will now hand you over to our expert, Andy Shaw.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. So just going to do a quick introduction to ourselves first before we get into the details. So my name is Andy Shaw. I've been working with Qt now for 17.5 years. I've been in the support department that entire time. So it's likely that if you're a customer of ours and you send a support request, that I've had some interaction with you at some point during those years.
And I'm Kati Kankaanpää. I have been working for Qt support for about 5 years.
Okay, so what we want to go over today in this webinar, we're just going to cover some basics for what resources are available for you, and then we'll get into some tips as to how you can debug your Qt application and then things to look out for. And then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So feel free to ask us anything at that point, and we'll answer as much as we can. So the available resources that we have, I mean, some of these are available to open source users as well. So we have the Qt forum, which is covered by mostly the community. We have some developers there as well. We have the Qt mailing list. This is available for using Qt as well as developing Qt itself. So if you're interested in more of the specifics on that side, then you have access to that. We have our FAQs. These are solely created by the support team within the Qt company, and we update these on a fairly regular basis whenever new frequently asked questions come in. So this is a good way to keep up to date with new problems. And of course, we have the Qt documentation, which is available and constantly updated. We try to keep that to the best quality possible. We have the Qt blog, which is a good way to hear directly from the Qt developers, and also other interesting figures inside the community. And lastly, but not least, we have the Qt support itself. It's obviously the team that I work with. It gives you, for our commercial customers, a chance to get support directly from within the Qt company. So to give a bit more background on what Qt support offers, we have 2 tiers. We have standard support, which is included in the licenses we sell. This gives a guaranteed response time within 2 business days. That's for most of the year. Obviously, some days for Christmas and Easter are not counted. We offer support on the Qt APIs, that's including the functions, how to use Qt, possible ways of how to achieve what you want to achieve using Qt. We also do workarounds and bug fixes where possible for any bugs that you may have encountered that get reported directly to the support team. And it also gives you an increased priority for any reported bugs in the bug tracker. So when we're informed about a bug, then we make sure that the developers in-house are aware that this is affecting the customer, and this gives an increased priority. The other tier that we offer is the premium support. This includes all of the standard features of standard support. In addition to that, we have a guaranteed response of 1 business day. You get a dedicated support engineer, which means that you'll have someone that's going to be working with all of your cases initially, and that will give them a better understanding of what challenges you may have for the application, and they understand what you are trying to achieve. You get the highest priority for any reported bugs that you have reported in the bug tracker. And you also get access to full application code analysis and debugging with the support team. This enables you to not have to send just a small example that reproduces a problem. You're able to look at the whole code, or at least as much as you're able to provide. And we also offer remote desktop assistance and troubleshooting, which enables us to get to the heart of the problem much more quickly and hopefully solve it in a very short space of time as well. So now that we've covered the resources, I'm going to give you some tips as to what we've seen while we've been handling support requests and debugging things. So these are a few things that are useful to know. So the first four we have listed here, these are all environment variables. These can actually be set before you run your application or inside your application. The Qt debug plugins, this is useful for seeing which Qt plugins are loaded and also which ones are attempted to be loaded. It will show all of the different files that it's trying to load. So it will also show anything that happens to be in the same directory. And then if it's not able to load it, it will indicate why that is the case. This is very useful in order to try and determine why certain plugins are being loaded or why it's not finding the ones that you're looking for. So looking at this, it's easy to see if something's picked up from the wrong path or something like that. Similar to that is the QML import trace environment variable. By setting that, it will output information about the types that are being resolved on when an application is running. This will also indicate where it's finding the different types. So again, you can use this to find out where the plugin is or where the QML file is, and then you can see at a glance if it happens to be loading the wrong one. And also you get more information as to why a type was not resolved if there is a problem at this point. So this is also very handy to use. So when it comes to looking at problems with the rendering inside QML, you might find that something's not rendering correctly or something like that. Then one thing that we always suggest is to set the QSG render loop environment variable to be basic. What this does is basically ensures that it's no longer using threads for the rendering of the QML. This is useful to see if it's working correctly then it means that you can have a look at the QML itself to see why it might not be working when used in separate threads. So this is a handy thing to see if it is specific to that side of things, or if there's still a problem, which means it might be a bug in Qt or a bug in the application generally. Then the last environment variable is the QSG info. This gives some basic OpenGL information and scene graph information for your QML applications at startup. And this is also useful to see, so you can see if something looks a bit odd that doesn't fit with what you expect from the graphics setup for your computer. As always with the four environment variables, it's useful to just try setting them just to see what the output looks like, because then if you can see what it looks like when it's running, it's useful when you're trying to debug your application later. For the other things we have listed here, the QMate query, this is you can run on the command line. This lists all of the internal paths that QMate has hard-coded. So if you're having problems with it finding certain libraries or include paths or something like that, you can use this to check that you have the right version of QMate running and that it is listing the paths that are the ones that you expect it to have. So you can see that if it's looking for the includes in the right directory for Qt and so forth. Qt this is useful for exporting the information about your graphics setup on the machine. It gives a lot of information about the OpenGL capability and also what the graphics driver and the graphics card is and things like that. If it's automatically going to fall back to Angle or to software rendering, then this will also indicate that on the Windows platforms as well. So if you have a customer or a user that's having a problem on a specific setup, then you can use this to see if it's falling back to or something like that. We have logging categories, which you may have heard of, using Q logging category, which is a new feature around Qt 5.5, I think it was. These can be enabled to get extra information about that particular module in Qt when the application is running. For example, we have one in the QPA plugin, qt.qpa.gl, which will list information about the OpenGL capabilities and what the support available when the application is started. We also have ones for Bluetooth and Scene Graph and also some of the other modules. Unfortunately, they're not all documented at the moment. There's no definitive overall list, but if you check the documentation for the modules you're using, you can use this to see which categories are available. And of course, we are endeavoring to update the documentation in this respect too. We also have tools in Qt Creator. There's a number of different tools available. Some are only commercially available, but we also have some that are available for open source users as well. We have the QML profiler, which is obviously useful for profiling your QML application to see where it's spending the time inside on the QML side. We have the Clang Static Analyzer, which is useful to detecting problems that are found by static code analysis. We have the Valgrind code analysis, which is useful when you're using the Valgrind tool. And we have the CPU usage analyzer, which obviously helps you with the seeing where the CPU usage is being used inside your application. So Qt Creator itself has a lot of tools available that you can use for debugging your application. Now, I have a couple of personal favorites of mine that I like to use, particularly when debugging an application that's been sent to us inside support. The first one being is event filters. I find this quite useful to install an event filter on an application. If you're not sure how that works, then you can check the Q event documentation in Qt. This allows me to catch when a particular event has come into the application, and then I can step through to see where this event ends up going. So if I suspected it's not going to the right widgets or it's not being handled correctly, I can use this as a means to find out what happened to that event and then try to determine where the problem is. So that's useful to have, and it's easy to install when you need it, so it doesn't bloat the application too much. And lastly, this is my personal favorite because I always like being able to use this one, is Git Bisect. For those that haven't used Git or have not heard of Git, this is a source code control system. We use this for Qt, both on the public server. And this is very useful to use if you know that a change has occurred that introduced a problem, but you don't know when it actually happened. You just know it's between a particular version and another particular version. This is useful to then use this, and it will automatically do a divide and conquer, if you will, to find which change introduced the problem. So this is also useful if you're trying to find which change introduced a problem inside Qt because you don't have access to support or you need to find out quickly. Then this is also a good way to find out what introduced the problem, so you can have a look to find a workaround or a bug fix yourself in that case. So if you haven't used it, then I recommend that you give that a go at some point. And of course, should you ever contact support and you have a problem, then if you're able to provide any of the information, particularly the first ones, the environment variables and the QMake or the QTIAC output, then this is also very useful for us to see straight away, and therefore can save you time and us time in getting a definitive answer to you for your problem. So moving on to some common pitfalls. And these are things that I've noticed and over my entire time in support. And these are good things to watch out for. They are people from time to time will make these mistakes, unfortunately. So when it comes to building Qt itself, it's very useful to double check the supported platforms and configurations page, especially when it comes to the compilers that are supported. We do test with those specific compilers. Although some older versions may work and newer versions may work, it's a good idea to at least make sure you are using which ones are supported, because these are the ones we know work. The QCore application constructor, you may have already spotted the mistake there. It has surprised me how many times this can actually go unnoticed, because it's such an easy mistake to make. The compiler will not complain, of course, when you accidentally use an integer for the application subclass as opposed to an integer reference. The reason we need it to be an integer reference is because Qt will actually modify the original value. And therefore, if it ends up modifying a copy, this causes problems later on, because it causes memory corruption, and then you might get some strange crashes that you can't explain. So if you're in a position where you are experiencing some strange problems and you have subclass the application object, then it's worth giving the signature a check. Make sure that you are using integer reference there. It's surprising as to the problems it can cause purely from that one tiny symbol. So high DPI, this is something that's been more and more of an issue from time to time. What you should do if you're seeing things that are not correct with the rendering of in high DPI mode, then check that you have the two attributes set. These are the application attributes: use high DPI pitch maps and enable high DPI scaling. So the pitch map one is to ensure that it will use the high resolution pitch maps if they're available for rendering. And of course, the latter will ensure that high DPI scaling is generally enabled for your application. Sometimes this is enough, and then you'll see the difference straight away. But if you're still experiencing problems, then there's a few things that you can check to make sure that you're doing all the things that is expected. So for starters, you have to make sure that you use the QReal versions inside the QPainter API if you're using QPainter directly. These are the ones that have the F character at the end of the function name, like set draw line F, for instance. You should also make sure you're using sizes for windows based on the screen size, and also try to make sure you use layouts as much as possible, because this will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. When creating images, then make sure you set the device pixel ratio to the DPI that you want, or you can set it to the screen device pixel ratio to make sure that it's compatible when rendering. And if it's the same, then this will also avoid transformations, so you can make sure that you're not getting any rendering artifacts because it's having to transform the image beforehand. So moving on to model subclassing. This is particularly for when you're implementing QAbstract item model yourself, as opposed to using the ones that we provide out of the box. This is tricky at times. When you're doing it the first time, it's easy to accidentally miss something. So it's a good idea to check that your functions particularly are handling invalid indexes correctly. Because if an invalid index is passed, then it's best to make sure that it handles that case, return straight away, because it is possible that they will be passed deliberately from inside the Qt cores. Also check that your index calls, if you're calling index, that they always give the same information each time for any given position in the model, especially in terms of the internal pointer that is part of the return Q model index. The key thing is mainly the internal pointer, because if something is deemed not to be the same, then it can end up causing certain things to behave strangely inside the view when it's showing the model. And then lastly, when it comes to the model subclassing, whenever you're manipulating the row count or the column count or things like that, then make sure you emit the about to signals first before making your changes, and then emit the signals afterwards to indicate that the change has been done, such as rows inserted and columns inserted. This is particularly true when you're directly manipulating the data and not going through any of the insert rows or set data calls, something like that. So this is very easy to accidentally forget one of those signals, which means the item view will not necessarily be up to date with the changes to the model. When it comes to graphic card issues, this is typically a problem more for Windows desktop because we find a lot of the graphics cards or drivers there are not able to provide the level of OpenGL that we require for QML. So it's possible we try to do have a fallback in those cases. We try to detect those cases, and we have certain cards and drivers blacklisted. But it's not always the case that these are in our blacklist, so you may see some problems as a result. If you happen to see those, then what you can do is that you can use the application attribute to turn on angle or to turn on software rendering, and then you can give that a try. And then you can also use the Qt angle platform environment variable to see if switching the type of angle platform, be it D3 D11 or D3 D9 or warp as possible options there. By trying these, you can see if the graphics look better, and then you can report that as a bug report or directly to the support team if you have access to indicate that you've had to use the fallback manually, because then we can update the blacklist in that case. When it comes to threading inside Qt, this is also obviously very useful and can improve things a lot on the performance side, but it's also tricky to use the first time if you haven't used them much, at least on the Qt side, especially with QObject-based types. The key things to remember here is to make sure that you do not create the objects with a parent, unless, of course, the parent is created inside the thread itself. The reason being is because it will belong to the thread that the object is created in, and therefore if it has a parent that belongs to another thread, then this will cause problems later on. Qt will typically warn you in these cases, so it's easy to catch those if you happen to have done that. It's also possible to move objects to the thread, and my personal recommendation is that you would create the object as normal without the parent, and then just move it to the thread that you want to actually have it working. So then that way it will ensure that everything is done safely. From a personal recommendation from a developer that I had some years ago, he said generally the best thing to try and do is to use the Q thread without subclassing it. In that sense, you create the Q thread and then you move the objects that you want to have work inside that thread by using move to thread on the Q object. It's also best to look at the documentation. We have some specific detailed documentation for threads that also covers more of the pitfalls and things to watch out for in case you need to figure out why your objects are not behaving correctly in this case. When it comes to using process events, this is a useful thing to use if you're trying to make sure certain events are processed at a given point. It's generally a safe thing to do, but you have to be a bit more careful sometimes. It's because if you're an event handler or if potentially if you're inside a slot, that calling process events can cause some events to be processed before you're ready for that to actually happen. Ideally, you shouldn't need to call process events unless you have a certain workflow that depends on it. So it's just generally, if you see strange things happening, then check if you have any process events calls inside your application code, and see if there's anything in there that might be causing the problem. Then lastly, this comes up a bit more often than you would think, is deleting objects, as in, for instance, calling delete this inside an event handler or a slot. Naturally, this is usually okay if you're careful about it, but unfortunately, when inside Qt, if you're inside an event handler or a slot, the Qt code expects that the object that invoked the event that it was sent to, or the object that has the slot, would still be valid when that actually returns. So if you want to delete the same object at that point, then the best thing to use then is to call delete later on that object. What this does is post an event to the event loop, so it ensures that this object will be deleted once the process has returned to the event loop. This is useful if you're seeing that something's crashing around that sort of time when you're trying to delete something. It should make sure that the object can then be deleted safely. So you can call delete later, and then it will take care of it for you once it's safe to do so. So now we come to the question and answer part of the webinar. So feel free to ask any questions. We'll try to answer as much as we can. So, Kati, will there be any questions waiting for us?
We have one question about QML, and it's what is the best way to implement multi-page application without stack view?
Without stack view, okay, that's an interesting one. I personally think the best way, I mean, naturally, I'd normally like to experiment a bit to see how well it works. But what I would personally do is I would probably have the different elements. I'll say top level, even though obviously there might be top level for within the stack, so to speak, and then just make them visible or when on need. To add an extra benefit there, if you put these inside a loader, for instance, then it should be possible to ensure that they're only being loaded when you actually need to use them. So that way, if you end up never showing some parts of that particular pages, then it means that you don't have to worry about having the memory used to keep them around, sort of thing. And you can also extend that, so you can actually do it in the sense that you could destroy them when you finish with them as well, if you were really tight on the memory. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, another question. What is the best way to deploy my Qt console application for Linux? I have tried the Linux deploy Qt tool, but I'm getting missing libraries error.
Yes, okay, that's something that we've been trying to work on internally, is to come up, because we obviously, for those that don't know, we have the deployment tools for Windows and Mac OS, but unfortunately we don't have one similar that works for Linux. I am aware of the tool that you refer to. I haven't used it personally, but generally speaking, the best way we find is to at least use, if this tool that you refer to isn't working, then you can use LDD to find the dependencies for your application at least. This will list all of the libraries that it depends on, and then you can start by making sure that they're available and any of the associated plugins. There's a deployment page in the documentation that helps at least list what plugins you might need to deploy. And then you can take it from there. I mean, because if the script is not working, then unfortunately at the moment there's a bit of trial and error to find out which dependency might be missing. If a particular library can't be loaded, then you can use LDD on that particular library to see which ones is missing. Generally speaking, what we recommend, at least when if you're going to deploy to other distributions on Linux, is to try and find the lowest denominator. This is usually potentially Red Hat or CentOS, because their dependencies are usually on the lower end of the version requirements, and therefore you have a better chance of those working on other distributions such as Ubuntu and Debian without too much of a problem. If you're lucky, then you don't have to have any extra packages installed at all. But hopefully we'll have a proper tool available at some point in the future so that we'll be able to make sure that this sort of thing works out of the box for you.
Okay, then we have another QML question. What is the recommended method for QML components to notify other QML components?
Okay, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by notify, so I'll go on the assumption that you want to send something like a signal or something like that from one component to another. You can do it in the same sort of way. You could set up a signal that can be emitted by the component, and then have connections that connects that signal to your component's function. I don't know if that would be enough. It depends on what sort of notification you want to do. It could also be sufficient to use a binding, because when a variable is updated, then it will automatically update any bound variables. So depending on what sort of a notification you're thinking of, then that also might be an option for you as well.
So can we force Qt to load its platform plugins from different folder than folder named plugins?
Yes, you can do that. Actually, I think you'll find that the plugins directory is not the default one. The reason there's a common misconception sometimes with deployment is that when you deploy Qt plugins, that you have to put them inside the plugin subdirectory. For the default case, that's not true. Basically, what you do, you deploy them into the same directory as your application executable. This is where Qt will look for the plugins by default. There will be like subdirectories from there, such as SQL drivers or platforms or image formats. If you want to change that directory, you can do that. There's a function inside Qt core application called set library paths. I think there's a complementary add library path as well. You can then pass the path that contains the subdirectories. So if you were to have a folder that was in your home directory, for instance, called Qt plugins, and then you would have your platforms subdirectory inside that, for instance, then you could call add library path or set library path with the home/Qt plugins directory. And then it will look inside there in addition to looking inside the current directory, as in the one that contains the application executable.
The next question is, can you talk a little about Qt certifications?
Can you elaborate on what certifications you're thinking of here? Are you thinking of for the code itself, as in so that it can be certified for use in certain devices, or do you mean as in training certification? We can come back to that as we can answer another about training. Okay, we already answered that. Was fast, thank you. To be honest, I would actually have to double check. I know that we did have a training certification in the past, and I, unfortunately to say, I honestly don't know if what the details are of that currently. So I think if you can get in touch somehow, then we can try and get back to you separately if with someone that can provide that information for you.
Hi, just a quick note. Is it Patricia? If you leave your email in the feed survey at the end, we can get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question?
Let's have a question about Qt location maps. There's a custom Geo Service plugin. It works fine on Mac OS and Android, but on iOS it doesn't load the custom Geo Service plugin with Get Plugins function. So what could be wrong?
Okay, there's two possibilities here. Being iOS, as some of you may be aware, there's like any mobile platform, there's always some permission requirements. On Android, this is easier because we're able to set the default ones, and therefore we already request them at runtime. But with iOS, you have to provide these explicitly. So one of the possible causes there is that you need to modify your info.plist file. Unfortunately, I can't remember the exact name to use. It's something to do with privacy and location. If you do this by Xcode, for instance, you can click on the pull down that it provides for it, and you should be able to find it by typing in location or something like that. You need to make sure that that is actually entered and that you set the value for it to location. If you have done that and it's still not working, then it's possible that it's not loading the plugin itself. This is on iOS. We build statically by default for Qt and therefore the application. And if you have been using a QML application, then you need to make sure that you are explicitly importing the Qt positioning module, and that way it will make sure that the tools that are used by QMate in order to import the plugins so that it knows which ones to include in the application are also included. So there's two things to watch out there at least. Hopefully that will solve your problem. Okay, I heard that the audio is fading in and out, so hopefully I'll make sure I move myself closer to the microphone, so hopefully it will sound better. Thanks. So do we have another question?
Let's talk about Qt standard item model in C++ and how to use the roles defined there in QML list view. For example, background role or foreground role.
Okay, so you want to access the roles on the QML list view. These are generally accessible directly by the role name. I'm trying to remember if Q standard item model makes them available automatically. I'm going to assume that they don't, so I can give the answer. This will apply for any roles that you add yourself. So if you have custom roles, this all works in the same way. Inside the model class, there's a role names function which you can re-implement. This, by what you can return in here, is the textual representation of the role that you want to provide inside the model. For textual representation of the role that you want to provide to access from inside your QML list view. So I believe the signature is a Q hash, so you specify the text, and then that refers to the actual role itself from the model side. So for instance, you could insert one that's foreground, and that refers to the Qt foreground role. And then what you can do then is that you can just refer to it directly inside your list view by using it in a similar way to how you may use the text keyword or something like that. You can refer to it as foreground, and then that can be used inside the delegate to how you want. So you can, obviously you don't have to use it to render the foreground in that color. You can do what you want with it. It's the means to accessing that data at least. So I would check the documentation for its role names inside the QAbstract item model. That will give you the correct signature. You just re-implement that, and then it should be self-explanatory from that how to make that information available from there. So I hope that answers the question for you. I'll just quickly take a bit of water before the next question.
So the next question is about the new QML cache. What's the difference between the existing Qt Quick compiler and the new QML cache? And are my QML files human readable when using QML cache?
Okay, that's a good question. Some of you may not be aware as to what the Qt Quick compiler is, so I'll hopefully give a reasonable overview of that. So that's a commercial offering that we had. Just for those that haven't caught the news, by the way, that will be merged into Qt 5.11, so that the functionality that was providing will actually be part of Qt in the next minor release. But what that was doing, that would basically effectively compile your QML code into C++ code for you, and then it would compile that into your application. This meant that it would overall it would be better performance because it didn't have to do this as part of the application itself. It wouldn't be compiling that code while the application was running. It was pure C++. And therefore you had the advantages and the performance advantages that brought to the table. With the QML cache, what this did was to basically improve the startup time of your application, because it was able to use a copy of, if it had already opened that QML file before, it was able to reuse the cache file, which enabled it to start up faster and access that particular type faster, so to speak. As for whether it was readable or not, I can't remember. I don't believe the cache file was readable because I believe it's in a binary output, but I can't say 100% sure because I would have to double check, but I'm pretty confident that it's not readable.
Okay, next we can talk about Qt Lite. Is Qt Lite available for startup commercial license? If yes, where to find it?
I can't say 100%. I believe that if the startup, I can answer in a sense, if the startup license is available for use with the Qt for device creation, then yes, it should be available. Qt Lite is only available as part of Qt for device creation. So you would need to obtain a Qt for device creation license to be able to use Qt Lite. So if that's available as part of the startup program, then it would be available. What I suggest you do is to just contact sales using the contact us form on the web page, and then they can tell you for sure whether it falls underneath that or not.
Okay, back to models. I have an issue with QProxy filtering model coupled with QFile system model. I am applying a custom filter, which might be quite slow, and occasionally get segfaults related to invalid indexes reported by the QFile system, e.g. in rows about to be removed signals. Is there a way to handle such things?
Yeah, referring back to my comment about the model subclassing, this is similar to this sort of thing here. I don't know if the only thing you're doing custom here though is the filter, so I'm assuming that you're not subclassing either the sort filter proxy model or the file system model. If that is the case, then based on what you have said, it sounds very much like it's actually a bug in Qt. I don't know if you have a support license or not. If you do, then please contact us via the support portal. Otherwise, I would suggest that you make a report on the public bug tracker so that we can at least investigate it further in that respect. As for what you might be able to do now in the meantime, the best thing to do is if you're able to debug it, to at least see where the seg fault is coming from. It's possible that you might be able to get around it by using a subclass of the sort filter proxy model, and then just trying to catch that cache before it actually causes the crash. I hope that's useful. It's a bit tricky to say, but at least based on what you've said, it sounds like it's definitely a bug in Qt if you're not subclassing either of those models, because it should be working with whatever filter you throw at it. It should not be crashing, at least.
Okay, then, is it a problem to use a lot of Q property to communicate between C++ and QML?
Okay, it's not a problem to use it a lot. I mean, there's always going to be a risk of a bit of overhead when you're adding more types of, more variables to the object class. But it generally, it's a lightweight around it, because it's just a case of having extra meta object information. So if you find it's useful to have used as a means of communication between the C++ side and the QML side, then generally speaking, there's no problem with having a lot of those. So you should be safe in doing that. I just saw that there's an update on our previous question about the sort filter proxy model, okay, which indicates that you are actually, in fact, subclassing the sort filter proxy model. So basically, if it's connected to the filter, then it depends on what parts you're actually re-implementing. Again, without knowing details about the crash specifically, all I can suggest is have, as I suggested generally, the model subclassing. Make sure that whenever you call index, that it's giving the right information back. This is especially true with the sort filter proxy model, because you need to make sure that you're able to map that back to the source model as well. So make sure that that information is always the same for the same data that you are checking it for. And assume that you're not going to be doing anything with removing and inserting rows. But again, if you are doing things like that, then make sure that the signals are being emitted before you do any changes, and then after the changes are done, you emit those signals as well. It's with something like that, it's always a bit tricky without seeing the specifics. So all I can suggest is really just make sure that especially the index function, make sure that that's returning the same information each time. If you can find it, I believe there was an old tool called Model Test. I think it's on GitHub somewhere. If you Google it, you should be able to find it. If you're able to get that to work, that's also a useful way to just run your model through that and see if it throws out any errors that you may have forgotten. Okay, so you're overriding filter except row. Yeah, I'll double check if you're changing that, then just make sure that you're returning the right information, especially because we have the source parent. You make sure you're returning an index for the right model at the right point, sort of thing. But this generally shouldn't be crashing if you're just returning true or false. So I would just double check that function and make sure you everything's behaving as it should. Like I said, get the stat trace, see where it's crashing, and hopefully that will help.
Okay, let's jump to style sheets. I am using style sheets to style my application, but it had issues with icons in menu. How should I overcome these issues in menus? Should I create a custom style for the menu only, because I want to still use the existing style sheet?
Okay, style sheets are always a bit annoying from time to time. One thing, at least with style sheets, is always important to remember that if you change one element of a widget with a style sheet, you usually have to make sure you have styled the whole thing. Sometimes you can get away with just changing one specific property, but a lot of times you have to account for the other changes that it introduced as a result. So you may find you have to account for other properties for that particular widget as well. So, but specifically with icons in the menu, I'm trying to think if you can actually have some issues, because if you're on certain platforms, the menus are not stylable because they're implemented as platform menus. For instance, on Mac OS, you have the native ones being shown. With the menus if it's on Windows or something like that, then it should work. Unfortunately, without seeing specifically what your style sheet is doing, it's hard to say. What we would really recommend is to try and break down the style sheet into the different elements. Cut it down first, so you just have just the menu part. You can unset the application one, for instance, to see if this makes a difference or not. If it's still behaving incorrectly when you have set it on just the menu and you don't have the application one set, then at least you know the problem is with that specific part of your style sheet. Otherwise, if it's working fine, then you need to just reintroduce parts back to your application one and see which element is causing the problem. Hopefully that helps you figuring out where the problem lies. And again, if you get stuck, then you can always obviously contact support if you have a license, and we can definitely help with that sort of thing, trying to work out why your style sheet is not working.
Okay, then a question about virtual keyboard. There's a bug that I cannot type with the virtual keyboard in dialog pop-up on Android.
Okay, so I assume by dialog pop-up that you're referring to QML here. This can be a problem if because the dialog, of course, is modal. So you might need to check that you haven't made it modal to the virtual keyboard, because that would prevent the input to it. So one possible solution is to make sure that the input panel part of the virtual keyboard is a child of the content item inside the dialog, but then you can have it draw outside of the dialog itself if you want to keep it separate. And then that way it will see the virtual keyboard and the dialog as one modal entity, so that way it will not block the input to that keyboard. So hopefully that will help you get on the right path for that. Okay, I think we've got time for one or two more questions. So
yes, well, on Windows, OpenGL drivers can be loaded dynamically. But how about the other backends that are now coming to Qt, for example, Vulkan or Direct3D? Is it possible to have similar dynamic loading for them too?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. We have currently, I believe, that the existing backends such as Vulkan and Direct3D one are currently on tech preview. They're not actually 100% included in Qt yet. They're all plugin based. So if there's a dependency problem, as in if Vulkan's not available on the system, for instance, then it will not load that plugin anyway. So you should be able to detect whether the functionality is available just by checking for that. In terms of being able to see if it's interchangeable, currently that's not the case, I believe. Once you go to use it, then you'll end up using that particular one. It's possible that we'll be looking into that in the future to make it easier to switch from one to the other. So if one is not available, then it'll fall back to OpenGL. But I believe that at least as it's designed right now, it's a case of just creating the instance and then it's expected to, you would expect it to be working at that point rather than having it fall back afterwards.
Okay, one more about installer framework. Is silent update available and how to do it?
Yes, it is possible to do silent updates. I assume you mean by that you can install, have the installer install silently like we would with other installer frameworks. This was available since 2.0, I think, so it's not been available for a long time. You can use the installer API. There's documentation that gives you information about the functions available, and you can use that to have it click through the buttons, set the fields to whatever you want to automatically as part of your install script. And you can finish off by making sure that it has the set silent function, which was introduced recently, or you can use the silent command line function as well, parameter, sorry, to indicate that it's running silently. So you can check in, if you have an install script that's doing a lot of things already for actual user interaction, you can extend that to check if the installer is running as a silent one, and then you can account for that inside your install script as well. The documentation is useful in this case because you can see what the names of the widgets are, so you can see which ones are available to you to have automate the clicking sort of thing.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
I would like to use Bluetooth on Raspberry Pi. Can I use Qt for that, and do I need to install a lot of additional software?
Yes, we have Qt connectivity module, which includes Bluetooth as part of that. That is available for all the platforms now, including the later version of Windows. So for the Linux-based platforms, including embedded Linux, it's available with the, I don't know how you pronounce it, so forgive me if it's wrong, the Bluis library. We support, I believe, versions 4 and 5, and that is the one that's currently the standard on the Linux-based platforms. So if on the Raspberry Pi, it should be available for that as well. So as long as that particular third-party library is available, then Qt can be built to use that one. If you have the Qt for device creation, I believe it already includes that. And then it will enable you to use Bluetooth inside your Qt applications as well. Okay,
that's it.
I think that's all the time we have for today, I'm afraid. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. And if you have any more questions we didn't go over, please send us an email at info@qt.io and we'll answer them for you. Also, please remember to fill in the survey at the end and let us know what you'd like to hear about in the future. We also have a host of other webinars coming up, so you can check those out at the webinar section of our website. But until then, I wish you all a great day or an evening. Goodbye.